honestly, I got the bug writing in probably like grade 6, grade 7. And I started writing stories then. It tended to be more science fiction then because I was big into science fiction. But I wasn't very good at it. So I love to read it, but I'm terrible at writing it. So no, and now what happened is, I was a massive reader as a young kid, and I still am. And I remember I used to go to a used bookstore in town. I had my rounds every weekend. I would go to this comic store and that store and this sort of thing. And one of them was a used place, and I saw this really cool book about a girl who had telekinetic abilities, and she was bullied. And I'm like, not my usual fare. I like science fiction, but it's got telekinetic abilities in there, so I might like it. And and I read Carrie, and that was the end. Like that was it. Now I was a horror freak, and not only was I a horror freak, that was the book that I kind of started thinking I could write this. Like, because I was a young kid, I was bullied and that sort of thing. So it's like, it really resonated with me on a lot of different angles. So that's where that's where I started thinking about it, and then started doing some stupid, dopey little horror stories that eventually somehow turned into books and et cetera, et cetera. So honestly, like probably, I think Carrie came out when I was like 13, or 12 or 13. So somewhere around there.
Yeah. And that's how you got started in the horror genre as well, writing it for yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I and my early attempts were literally to kind of write my own version of Carrie. So obviously that's changed since then, but yeah, no, it's how my mind works. If I sit down to try and write something else, like if I was to write a mystery, it would be a horror mystery. If I was to write a science fiction novel, it would be a horror science fiction novel. There's always that horror element in there now. So the horror switch is always on.
Okay. So how do you come up with an idea? So walk us through your process.
Oh, it comes from everywhere. It's funny. I was earlier today, I was listening to your interview with Daniel Barnes, who is a lovely guy, and I've been interviewed by him, and we've become very good friends. And he said, there's times where he's just walking down the street and he'll see something and get an idea, and that's me. I will pick up from everywhere. News stories, events in my life, events in my family's lives, song lyrics, a TV show, and it's kind of like, oh, I could do that better than that. Literally, it comes from everywhere, and it's like a big stew where everything goes in. As an example, I've got a short story that I'm starting to write now, and it started from me, believe it or not, listening to the Bee Gees. The song "Nights on Broadway," and I don't know if anybody's ever really listened to the lyrics of "Nights on Broadway," but it is a full-on stalker song. The person who is singing is stalking somebody, and it's very apparent when you just kind of strip the music away and listen to the lyrics. So I thought, that's interesting. That's kind of neat. And I couldn't, I was like, it'd be neat to kind of do a story based on a Bee Gees song. But where do I go with it? Like, stalkers are a dime a dozen sort of thing. And then go forward about a month, and I'm reading this story about a woman who's, her husband, and I can't remember how he died, but her first husband died, and his heart was donated to somebody else.
Yeah.
who that woman ended up marrying. And then that person eventually died as well. And I'm like, she's had two husbands, but they've had the same heart. So that kind of fed into, what if that second one was the heart calling to her, and that's why they're stalking. So then it kind of goes from there. And then I heard this fantastic story like 2 weeks ago that I'd never heard before, that Mary Shelley apparently carried around and kept the heart of her husband after he drowned. They brought him up on the beach. They burned his body, but now some claim it is the heart. Some claim it might have been a saltwater soaked liver that survived the fire. Who knows what it was? But for her thoughts, it was his heart that she kept with her for 30 years. And after she died, they found it wrapped in silk, and one of Percy Shelley's poems wrapped around it as well. So there's a Bee Gees song, this weird heart transplant news story, and then this little factoid about Mary Shelley, and I've suddenly got a really cool story. So I literally get stuff from everywhere. It comes from everywhere.
So are you a potter or a pantser?
Yes. So here's how I work. I have to know the beginning. I have to know a few things through the middle, and I have to know how it ends. So what I will do typically is for a short story, it's 3-4 bullet points at most. For a novel, could be 5, could be 15, but I have a series of bullet points, but they're key scenes, I guess is the easiest way to say it. They're key scenes that I know have to come out to kind of move to the next thing. But there's a lot of space in between there. So I have a lot of room to play. And so I plot out the basic skeleton of it. But as I write it, there is these vast areas where I am pantsing from, okay, I've got from this bullet point, now I have to get to that next one. How do I get there? I'm going to make it up as I go, sort of thing. So it's a combination of the two. And I've used this term before, but I firmly believe this is the most accurate way to say it. Those areas that I haven't planned is where the magic happens. This is where I start building connections, and this is where the characters start to talk to me, and I stop writing and they start dictating and things like that. So it's a combination of the two.
Yeah, as long as you get to those points that you've plotted, you're not bothered.
Yeah, and the damn thing is, as I said, I have to know the end of it. But with this method, I often find that my characters are kind of like, okay, that's a lovely ending, Tobin, but it's not the one for this story. So we're just going to give you the new ending now, and you can ignore that one. And that's often what happens. It's like, fantastic. Okay, now what do I do? I haven't even got an ending anymore. But it always works out, and the ending is always I'm more happy with the one that ends up than the one I had planned. So
So how do you go about creating your characters?
I don't create the characters; they create themselves. And that sounds bizarre, I know, but so I will. Excuse me. I will have a general idea, but my characters keep messing with me all the time. As an example, in this 6-book horror series that I've got, in book 5, and I tell a little bit about this at the end because I have author's notes at the end of each of the books, but in book 5, I had a character that, and I wrote a lot of the book, and he comes back to his hometown that he never wanted to come back to, but his mom was murdered, and he had to find out what the heck was going on. Actually, sorry, his father was murdered, and he had to come back for the funeral, etc. I got some of the way in, And this character said, "I'm not a guy, I'm a woman." So then I had to go back. And that actually adjusted a lot of things in the plot. Suddenly it couldn't be dad that died, it had to be the mom that died, and for certain plot things. And so then I had to kind of do a lot of rewriting there. But so I will have an idea of a character, like I kind of have the basic. I know they're troubled, or they have a history with this, or in the first book, I've got Talia, who is a 9-year-old girl, and I know at the start of it, all I knew was she was not happy with her younger sister, because once baby showed up, dad left. So she is, of course, blaming the younger sister. Sister arrives, dad leaves. So, and that's really all I knew about Talia at the start. But as I start to write them, their voices start to come up, their mannerisms start to show up, their motivations start to show up. I don't plan that ahead of time. I just start writing and they tell me. So and the other way this works is I don't do kind of one draft ever. Like I will write and then I have to go back, and especially in that first third where I'm getting to know those characters, I can go back, and knowing them now, I can start to fill them in and adjust the dialogue so they sound more like they do later in the book and things like that. So I mean, I have taken liberties with some real people that I know, and I've mashed people together and things like that. But in the end, the characters themselves really dictate how they want to be portrayed to me, to the point that when I finished the last book in this series and I had no more stories to write with these characters, I actually, as weird as it's going to sound, I went through a bit of a grieving period. Like they had all died. I had lost like a whole bunch of friends because they lived in my head for so damn long.
Yeah.
So I've never experienced that before. It was bizarre. But for me, it was like, okay, I think I must have done something right. If they're hitting me this hard, I hope they hit the readers this hard. And the feedback I've gotten from people who have gone through the whole 6-book series is literally, I've had a couple of them come back already and go, "What am I supposed to do now? I haven't got any of these characters anymore. What am I supposed to do now? Thanks, Tobin." So mission accomplished.
Do you think as authors we could do some psychiatric help?
So say that again, sorry?
I said, do you think as authors, as horror authors, we could do with some psychiatric help?
Oh, God, yes.
What would that character?
We need somebody on speed dial.
That character's talking to us and us wanting to kill everybody in sight.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I there's actually a couple of my readers kind of like, why do you kill the characters I love the most, Tobin? And so I'm an awful person on paper, but for the record, I have not killed anybody in real life. So, there is that. Of course, even a guilty person would say that, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they definitely would. I mean, there was something on TikTok, wasn't there, a few months ago about how horror authors I think it was mainly aimed at the splatterpunk ones that need psychiatric help. Yeah, and we shouldn't be writing disgusting things, but obviously,
Well, but and the weirdest thing is, and I'm sure you found this, I mean, I've come to know a lot of horror writers, and they are just wonderful people.
Yeah,
they're lovely. I think because they get all their weird mental freakiness down on the page, so it doesn't live in their head. I don't know, but no, you know what? I mean, I write weird stuff, but overall, I'm not a bad guy.
No, you are right. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of authors, and I've seen it in the groups myself, how friendly other authors are, and it's a very supportive community as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very much so. Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't know that I've really met any horror authors that haven't just been absolutely wonderful people. So,
Yeah,
which is a good thing.
it is definitely.
I know, because you expect them to be creeps, right? Like, they dress all in black and they don't wash and their hair is greasy and they don't talk to people. But
Yeah. Okay, so what's been the hardest thing about writing a book in the horror genre?
I don't think it's necessarily the horror genre. The hardest thing is always just, for the longest time, it was having the time. It's the sitting down and writing every day and putting the words down and giving myself, and I've actually taught creative writing as well. I actually taught it for 20 years, and in a 12-week course of 3 hours every week, the very first thing I talked about was try and write every day and give yourself permission to write utter garbage, because you'll write crap. You'll write good stuff, but you'll write crap too.
Yeah.
And you can't go back and, at least for me, and I know there is no one right writing style. There is no wrong one. But for me, I have to get the story down first. Then I can go back and I can clean it up and make it pretty and make it sing and, have all those echoes that work through it and callbacks and all of that type of stuff. So, and if I'm not writing on a regular basis, and by regular, I mean daily, then I start to lose those connections because the story isn't, as it doesn't sit completely in my head, because it was like a month ago and now I'm sitting down again. What the heck was I writing last month? That sort of thing. So that was, and honestly, that was the big push that allowed me to get a 6-book series done. It's when I do signings, I have people say, well, how long does it take you to write a book? And I'll point to like the first couple and go, well, those were like 10, 12 years. The last one took me 3 months because I had the first two and I was tweaking them and I was rewriting them and I was cleaning them up and I was never kind of progressing much beyond that. And I had maybe half of the third one done. And then the world pushed pause for 2 years when COVID hit. And suddenly we were in lockdowns. And I can remember literally the first day of the first lockdown going, I am never going to have great swaths of time like this ever again. So I have to start writing this stuff. And I wrote the 3.5 books and then went back and kind of cleaned them all up and integrated them all nicely and everything else over the span of those COVID lockdowns. So, that to me, it was I know it was hard and it was an awful time for everyone, but I would take another lockdown happily because it was great for my writing.
I can honestly say that I wouldn't.
Yeah, well, I fully understand why you would say that too, because there's elements of it that I really didn't like either. But overall, no. Honestly, though, I swear, if the lockdowns hadn't happened, I truly don't know if I would have had this series out by now.
Yeah, first lockdown for us in a house with 4 kids.
Oh, no. Good Lord. Okay, that's a horror novel in its own right.
Yeah. Yeah, never again.
Yeah, no, see, I was like, my kids are grown and they're out of the house, and I had actually just retired just about a year before the first lockdown. So, yeah, so it was kind of a perfect storm for me, and I know it wasn't for a lot of people, but it really was for me. So, yeah.
So, have you come across a difficult scene?
Yes. I've come across multiple difficult scenes, to be quite frank. Yeah, there's, and I won't go into detail because honestly, the shock value is kind of required when you're reading
Yeah.
it. But there was, I write, okay, my tagline is, I write ugly stories about terrible or horrible people doing terrible things. And it's true. It really is. So to kind of preface this, in the series, I have a for want of a better term, I guess, a magical or supernatural book with very bad intentions. I have werewolves. I have vampires. I have Lovecraftian type demons. There's a lot of supernatural stuff going on, and all of those supernatural entities do terrible things. But I also very much like the very grounded, very realistic, very non-supernatural horror of like a Jack Ketchum. Jack Ketchum was my second major influence after Stephen King. And for me, in my books, the worst monsters are the human ones, because there's a lot of horror in our world right now. We don't need vampires and werewolves to scare the crap out of us. There's a lot of really bad things happening because there's a lot of bad humans. And so through the series, my humans do some pretty awful things. Some of which it was, when I was writing, it was like, oh, this is terrible, but it's fun to write. There has been two scenes specifically, one in the 5th book and one in the final book, that were not fun to write. They were awful to write. But to get the horror across that I need to get across, I probably, quite frankly, was more specific than I probably needed to be. But I needed it to hurt. So the one in the 5th book was pretty bad. But here's the crazy thing. In the 6th book, I had literally, as I said, it took me 91 days to write the first or the final book. I actually wrote it in 90 days. Wrote the end, went to sleep, and I remember thinking as I'm falling asleep, I don't know if I put the main character through enough of a ringer in her earlier life to justify some of the emotional trauma that she's displaying later in life. I should probably go back and put a scene in there. And I had a simple scene in my head when I sat down to write. Just a very simple scene. I knew what I was going to write. And once again, my characters take over. And by the end of the scene, which was much longer than I expected, I am absolutely, completely honest here when I said that I was crying and I was shaking because I had no intentions of writing anything like that. And I don't even, to this day, God's honest truth, to this day, I don't know where that scene came out of. It was not in my head when I started writing it, but it was down on the paper. And I was actually, honest to God, traumatized by it. And I kind of had to sit there but it was exactly what I think the story needed. When I came out and sat down and, a little while later, I was talking to my wife about it and I started telling her a little bit about the scene. I started crying again. Like it hit me hard, harder than anything else I've ever written in my life before or since. So yeah, there's been a couple of times where it has, I enjoy writing, but those 2 times I didn't enjoy the writing.
Yeah.
It needed to be written, but I didn't enjoy it.
Yeah, that's the thing though, isn't it? When you're writing a story, sometimes the story takes over, doesn't it? And you just carry on writing.
Yeah. And the more I've written, the more that has happened with my own writing. And I do co-author with another author as well. We haven't published anything as yet, but we've written a couple of stories. And it's funny because he'll write something and then I'll come in after him and I start writing. And he reads it later in the day. He's like, oh my God, that was amazing. Where'd that come from? And I'm like, no idea. No clue. I have no idea. And, and that's not me being, falsely modest or anything. There's times where I sit down and I have no idea what's going to come out of me. It just comes out, and it's a cool feeling because I am actually experiencing it almost as the very first reader of that. If that makes sense. It's kind of neat. It's like, damn. So, yeah, it's weird.
Do you ever feel sorry for what you put your readers through?
Couple of times, yeah, but most of the time, nah, they deserved it. Most of the time, nah. You earned that.
Not heard it been put that way.
Again, I'm a nice guy in person. I really am. Just reinforcing that, okay?
Okay, so have you had any memorable feedback from any of your readers?
Yes, I have. I frequently tell the story of my cousin. I have one cousin who's very close to me in age, and she's almost like the sister I never had. And I love her dearly. And she got the first book in the series, and I got a message from her a little while later, and she said, okay, well, I just hit X scene, which is about halfway through the book. And she goes, and I put it down, and I don't ever intend on picking it up again, nor will I ever read anything else of yours, because I can only handle so much of your madness, which I loved. I absolutely loved. I've had that. I've had... I did a reading at one time, like a public reading at a bar. There was actually 3 authors who were doing our readings, and I had one of my friends after, and I'm up on stage and there's lights in my eyes, so I can't even see the audience. And of course, I'm concentrating on reading. And so I had no knowledge of really what was going on, a foot past the page of the book. And I had a friend come up as I was coming off the stage. She goes, oh my God, did you see those 2? And I'm like, 2 what? What are you talking about? And apparently I got to a specific part in the first book. And these 2 women, my friend told me that one got up and she looked completely angry and stomped out of the place. And her friend looked more distressed and had her hand over her mouth as though she was trying to not throw up as she ran out. So it wasn't direct feedback to me, but it was pretty cool. And I should probably be upset that I'm doing this to people, but I'm really not. It's kind of like I'm a horror author, so I'm trying to horrify. But my utter favorite, came from, believe it or not, a neighbor. I used to live across the road from this guy. We'll call him Greg. And I lent him the book, and I say a month later, he comes by and knocks on the door, and I open it, and he's just kind of looking, and he's like, I read your book. I'm, oh, okay. So I come out, and we're standing on the front porch of my house, and I noticed very quickly he's not looking at me. He's looking anywhere but me, and he's mostly looking back across the road at his own house. And I think I said something like, so what'd you think? And he stares off to the distance. He reaches into his pocket. He pulls out a pack of cigarettes, opens the package, pulls a cigarette out, very deliberately puts it in his mouth, reaches into his pocket, pulls out his lighter, lights a cigarette, gets it going, takes a couple of good long puffs on it, still hasn't looked at me at all, pulls the cigarette out of his mouth, blows the smoke out, and just says, fuck. Puts the cigarette back in his mouth and walks across the street. To this day, I don't know how he really felt about it, but it's my favorite review ever. I love that one. And we never talked about my writing ever again.
You're
So
terrified in there.
I certainly hope so. But that's absolutely my favorite of all time ever.
So,
So,
have you got any more exciting projects that you're currently working on?
oh, I've always got a ton of stuff on the go. So literally on my desktop right now, I am looking at 4 different files. The first one I can't say a lot about because I've actually been hired to write a nonfiction book. That is, and I took it on. I am not a nonfiction writer, and everything I write is horror. But the story that this involves it's real life, but it's probably the most horrifying thing I've ever written. And there's times where I normally sit down and I'll write for an hour or 2. And there's times where with this, I sit down and I write for 10 minutes. I have to get up and walk away. So I'm working on that one. And I expect that to be done probably very early next year. Right beside that one on my desktop, I have a novel that I'm about, say, 2/3 of the way through, which is part haunted house story, part possession story. And I'm having a lot of fun with that one. It's a standalone, so it's not in a series. It's not part of this other world or anything like that. And I'm getting to build brand new characters and go in a whole different direction because I have never done a haunted house type thing before. So that's kind of fun. Beside that, I have the short story that I mentioned kind of off the top there, the whole Bee Gees Nights on Broadway inspired one. Yeah. And finally, I also do have, I just finished working up an outline with my writing partner, Dale, where we, again, it takes me in a different direction, still horror, but Dale is... where I am more of a Stephen King, Jack Ketchum, that kind of thing, more contemporary horror. Dale is firmly in the Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe sort of gothic, Bram Stoker, etc. Yeah. So when we come together, it's really interesting because interestingly enough, our styles are very complementary as opposed to clashing. So we're actually working on a couple of different things, but this one involves, for the shorthand, I guess, a lot of the universal monsters, but in a kind of a bit of an interesting morality tale about immortality, primarily based around a Frankenstein idea. And then we also have another one involving a whole different story involving the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, regaining their humanity and refusing to bring down the apocalypse when God calls for it, which has been just a blast to write. So I've got a few things on the go.
Sounds like you're going to have a busy year.
I think I can have a busy couple of years, to be honest. So, and on top of that, I would actually like to get something out next year. So I've got a series of short stories that I'm kind of slowly kind of going through and collating, kind of going, which ones do I want to put into a bit of a collection as well. So yeah, I've got several irons in the fire right now.
Yeah. Do you work on several stories at the same time?
I never used to. For me, it was always, I'm doing this, and when I'm done this, then I'll do that sort of thing. But when I started doing this series, the 6-book series, just out of necessity, especially, okay, I keep talking about it, but so there is 5 books in the series and then a final 6th one that wraps everything up. In the first 5, you tend to get different characters. Some cross over, but you have a new main character and typically a new timeline too, because 1975, 1981, 2002, we're all over the place.
Yeah.
So that's the first 5 books. In the final book, I pull a character from every single one of the previous books, and they all come together in the last one. So I had to, for the first time, really kind of carry the current story I was writing on, but also be very aware of the previous 5 that I'd already kind of written, because I was also making notes to myself. I'll, insert a quick scene here in book 4, or put this in book 2, and that sort of thing, just to tie them together a bit more. So that kind of got me into a whole different mindset for writing. So now I'm carrying at least 5 books or 5 stories. They're not all books, but the 5 stories in my head at any one time. So whichever one I kind of know exactly where I'm going next, I'll move over to that one and I'll write on that for an hour. And then, let's take a look at this one. Have I got any ideas? Yeah, you know what? I can add a few pages here too. So I'm kind of, for the first time, I'm bouncing around now, which is new for me. I've never done that before. So we evolve, I guess, as we write. I don't know, like as we, I guess, gain skills and gain some experience and that sort of thing. I felt very much like I've evolved. I don't know if you felt that way, but the way I write today is not how I wrote even 2 years ago, and that's not how I wrote 5 years before that. So
yeah. It's right. You do evolve over each piece that you write.
Yeah. It gives you one more, I guess, some more tools in the tool belt, I guess. I don't know.
That's right. So how would you sort of like give advice to somebody who was wanting to write in the horror genre specifically?
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a good question. Couple of things, a few things. The first is, again, what I said when I talked about teaching writing is try and write every day, and do give yourself permission to write garbage, because it will happen. And it's so much easier to fix something that's on the page than to try and get it perfect the first time. So, and that's just general writing. That doesn't matter if that's horror, romance, or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. For horror, where the advice that I would give, because I think it's helped me a lot, is I find it's interesting when I look on like Instagram or TikTok and I see like kind of bookstagram, and nothing against them. This is not a criticism in any way. But I find that people seem to be locked into certain genres. Like, I'll only read horror, or I'll only read romance, or I'll only read westerns, or whatever. Doesn't matter. I'll only read true crime. I think one of the things that's really helped me with not only what I write in horror, but how I write it, is I read widely. I read mystery. I read biographies. I read science books. I read horror, of course. I love music biographies. I read military action novels, and I read everything. Pretty much the only things I don't really tend to enjoy much of is romance and like a hardcore Western. Give me a Western horror and I'm all over it. But hardcore Western and romance are probably the only two things I don't tend to read a lot of, though I have read them. But for me, I can read something and I don't care what it is, but if it's good writing or it makes me feel something, then I can kind of go, oh, how did they do that? How did they get me there? And I can take that and apply it to what I'm writing. Because for me, and again, it depends on what kind of horror you want to write, because there's so many different types. There's extreme horror. There is, for basically your beach read type horror, which is very light and fluffy. It's just a lot of people die, whatever. For me, I really want to have a reader get invested in my characters, and really, these are people that they would know, or they would hang out with, or they would really like to be around. Because if you're reading a book and you don't enjoy the characters, the book is probably not as much fun. And to do that, I get to pull from, that mystery novel, or, that Sherlock Holmes story, or this music biography, or, whatever it may be. And take all of that and bring it to bear on my own stories, and with my own personal experiences, and hopefully get the reader to really feel something. I've always said, when a reader finishes my book, if they love it, fantastic. If they hate it, fantastic. It's the ones in the middle that just kind of go, it was okay. Those are the ones that bother me. I want you to feel something. Yeah. So for me, I guess the biggest advice would be read widely, and really read bad stuff, read good stuff, and try and figure out why the bad doesn't work, or why the good works so well, and kind of go from there. It's okay to take the old tropes and mess with them, or to stay true to the classic forms. Okay, I've got a vampire, he can control the creatures of the night, and he can explode into 1,000 bats, and you can't face sunlight. Fantastic. You know what? Lean into it and play with it, and throw some really cool stuff at it. You're going to have a great story. So I don't know. I don't even know if that's very good advice or not. It's just, but off the top of my head, that's where I'm coming from. I see so much stuff that I love right now. I see, everybody knows what a horrible person that H.P. Lovecraft was. I mean, his ideas of races and things like that. And I love seeing some really good African American writers taking his stuff and just dissembling it and making it even better. And that to me is amazing, because you could just say, no, Lovecraft was a racist, I don't even want to deal with him. But these guys are going to go, nah, you know what? I'm just going to take it and I'm going to run with it. So there's all of these things that there's just so many ways to come at it. There's no one right way. And trust yourself. I guess that's the other thing, is just trust yourself. Come up with an idea, sit down and write the hell out of it. Write the story that's going to entertain the hell out of you.
Yeah, that's right. It's good advice.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I mean, the only thing I'd say is, if you, after listening to me ramble for this amount of time, if you are interested in my books, they are available everywhere. Basically, they are available on Amazon. They are available through Google Play. They're available through any of your stores. I think Waterstones is the very big one through the UK. Is that right? Is that kind of your? That's right. So they're available through Waterstones. They're available through Barnes and Noble in the U.S. and Chapters Indigo in Canada. Independent retailers can order them. They are through Ingram, so anybody can order them from anywhere. I'd love if somebody does read them. I would love to hear what you think about them, even if you show up at my doorstep and mostly spend the time lighting a cigarette and swearing at me before you walk off. I'll still take it. I will take that review.
If only you could put that review into words.
Oh, God, seriously. If I hadn't known, I would have videotaped them, I swear.
It's been lovely speaking to you, Tobin.
Thank you. It's been fun. I appreciate it. And thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome.